The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky over Pasadena felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The neon sign of a small Italian restaurant flickered in the distance as two of the most famous voices on earth prepared to do the most dangerous thing imaginable: sit down and eat dinner like normal human beings. Inside, candles were already lit. Outside, history was about to collapse into chaos. The door opened, a woman stepped in, and 11 minutes later, helicopters were circling the building. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. On November 14, 1991, Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston attempted something almost no one would ever understand. Something more daring than a moonwalk on live television, more risky than singing the national anthem in front of millions, more terrifying than stepping onto any stage. They tried to have dinner. Not a gala, not a charity banquet, not a private chef at a mansion guarded by security and silence. Just dinner. Two friends, two legends, two human beings who hadn't eaten in public without a crowd in years. The restaurant was small, quiet, Italian, a place where couples shared plates of pasta and waited for dessert menus. No velvet ropes, no flashing cameras, no screaming crowds. Or at least that was the plan. But fame doesn't care about plans. And Michael Jackson knew that better than anyone alive. The plan that took 3 weeks to build. 3 weeks. That's how long Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston spent planning one normal dinner. 3 weeks of phone calls, security briefings, secret entrances, decoy cars, timing rehearsals, wardrobe discussions, and location scouting. Not for a concert, not for a world tour. For pasta. Michael Jackson wanted to feel normal again. Not normal in the way fans imagine, normal like eating cereal in pajamas or driving to a grocery store. Normal like sitting across from a friend, hearing the clink of silverware, tasting warm bread, and talking about life without worrying who was watching. Whitney Houston understood that need better than most. She had reached superstardom by 1991. Her voice filled stadiums. Her face was on magazine covers. But she still remembered life before the fame, before the bodyguards, before the flashbulbs. Michael Jackson didn't. Not really. He had been famous since childhood. The world had known his face since he was 5. He had never walked through a mall unnoticed, never stood in line, never sat in a restaurant without whispers spreading like wildfire. And yet he still wanted to try. This dinner wasn't about hunger. It was about freedom. They chose a small Italian restaurant in Pasadena, not Beverly Hills, not Hollywood. Pasadena felt quieter, safer, more normal. They agreed to arrive separately. They would dress casually. No sequins, no glamour, no sunglasses inside, no obvious security. They would use the back entrance. Just two friends eating pasta. 11 minutes, that's all they wanted. But fame doesn't measure time the way humans do. It moves faster. It spreads faster. It explodes faster. The arrival that changed everything. Whitney arrived first. Not in a limousine, not in a parade of black SUVs. She arrived quietly in an unassuming car wearing casual clothes. No body armor, no stage costume, just Whitney Houston, human, beautiful, calm. Inside the restaurant, no one screamed. Not at first. People looked up. They stared. Some froze. Some whispered. But no one stood yet. Whitney took her seat at a small table near the window, a simple table, a table meant for ordinary people. She smiled. She exhaled. For a moment it worked. Michael Jackson was watching from a nearby car, just out of sight. His heart was already racing. He had lived long enough to recognize the early signs, the slight shift in energy, the subtle tightening of air in a room, the moment before silence turns into noise. He hesitated, but he went in anyway. Through the back entrance. No announcements, no cameras. Just Michael Jackson, wearing a baseball cap, casual jacket, trying to blend into a world that had never allowed him to blend. When he stepped into the dining room, time slowed. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else gasped. Someone stood. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the room felt different. He walked to Whitney's table. They smiled at each other. They laughed softly. They sat. And for exactly 11 minutes and 34 seconds, they were just two friends in a restaurant. 11 minutes of almost normal. The menus arrived. Water glasses were filled. Bread was placed on the table. Michael Jackson picked up a menu, scanning it as if he were deciding between spaghetti and fettuccine, like any other person in America. Whitney leaned forward, teasing him about his choices. They laughed. They talked about music. They talked about life. They talked about how exhausting fame could be. Michael Jackson said something quietly. Whitney nodded. She understood. For a moment, it almost felt safe. But outside, someone had already made a call. The whisper that became a roar. Michael Jackson is inside. Those words traveled faster than sound. They traveled faster than reason. They traveled faster than any security plan. Within minutes, people outside the restaurant began to gather. At first, it was just a few. Then more. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Someone took a picture. Someone shouted his name. Someone screamed. The crowd grew like a storm cloud. Inside, Michael Jackson felt it before he saw it. He felt the shift. The subtle vibration in the air. The low hum of voices growing louder. He looked toward the window. He saw faces pressed against glass. He saw phones raised. He saw flashes. Whitney looked too. Her smile faded. They hadn't even ordered yet. The moment fame broke the night. Outside, people began to push. Cars slowed. Traffic stopped. People climbed onto hoods. Someone ran into the street. Someone called the news. Someone called the police. Someone called their friends. The restaurant staff froze. The manager panicked. Inside, Michael Jackson sat perfectly still. He had lived this moment 1,000 times. He knew what came next. Chaos. Security entered the restaurant. Not quietly. Not discreetly. They moved quickly. Urgently. They whispered into radios. Michael Jackson looked at Whitney. She nodded. They both knew. This dinner was over. They hadn't even ordered. They hadn't even taken a bite. Outside, the noise grew louder. Then louder. Then deafening. People pressed against the glass. Someone tried to open the door. Someone screamed his name again. Michael Jackson lowered his head. Whitney reached for his hand. Not as a superstar. As a friend. As a human being watching another human being lose something invisible but essential. Privacy, the sky begins to roar. And then, something happened that turned the moment from chaotic to cinematic. A low rumble. Distant. At first, no one noticed. Then the windows vibrated. Then the sound grew louder. Then unmistakable. Helicopters. 3 of them. Hovering overhead. Light sweeping the streets. Rotors cutting through the night air. The crowd erupted. People screamed. People pointed. People surged forward. Police arrived. Barricades were pushed. Traffic was shut down. The small Italian restaurant in Pasadena had become the center of a media storm. Inside, Michael Jackson hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He stared at the table, at the bread, at the menu, at the untouched water glass. This was the dinner he had planned for 3 weeks. This was the freedom he had hoped for. This was the normal moment he had dreamed about. And it lasted 11 minutes and 34 seconds. The dinner that never happened. Security made the call. They could not stay. Not safely. Not peacefully. Not without someone getting hurt. The manager apologized. The staff stood frozen. The other diners stared. Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston stood. They walked toward the back. Not together. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Two friends leaving a restaurant they had never really entered. But something unexpected happened. As they reached the back door, a server approached them, holding 2 bags. Inside were takeout containers. Pasta, bread, salad, food they had never ordered. Food prepared because someone hoped, just maybe, they'd get to eat. Michael Jackson took 1 bag. Whitney took the other. They thanked the staff. They left. Outside, chaos erupted. They didn't walk. They didn't wave. They were rushed into vehicles. Sirens blared. People screamed. Helicopters hovered. And just like that, they were gone. Not to a hotel. Not to another restaurant. Not to a private dining room. They went home. To their mansions. To eat alone. 2 bags of pasta, 2 empty rooms. Michael Jackson sat alone that night. In a room larger than most houses. With walls lined in gold records. With chandeliers overhead. With silence echoing in every corner. He opened the bag. He looked at the pasta. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak. He ate. Whitney Houston did the same. In her own mansion. In her own silence. 2 legends. 2 voices that had filled stadiums. 2 hearts that had tried for 11 minutes to feel normal. And failed. The prison no one could see. This wasn't just a story about dinner. It was a story about a prison. Not one with bars. Not one with guards. Not one with walls. But one with cameras. With expectations. With fans. With fame. Michael Jackson had become the most famous human being on Earth. But that fame came at a cost no one could calculate. He couldn't go shopping. He couldn't go to the movies. He couldn't sit in a park. He couldn't eat dinner. Not without chaos. Not without crowds. Not without helicopters. And he wasn't alone. Whitney Houston felt it too. She had felt the shift. The moment when people stopped seeing her as a woman and started seeing her as a symbol. As a voice. As a brand. As an event. But that night, something became painfully clear. Even 2 of the most powerful artists in history couldn't sit in a small restaurant for 12 minutes without the world crashing through the doors. Michael Jackson and the cost of being loved. Michael Jackson had always been loved. But he had also always been alone. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. But physically. He lived behind gates. Behind walls. Behind security. Behind schedules. Behind layers of protection so thick that even breathing felt regulated. This dinner wasn't just about hunger. It was about touch. It was about presence. It was about being seen as a human being and not a spectacle. He wanted to hear forks clink. He wanted to smell garlic and bread. He wanted to laugh with a friend, without microphones capturing every breath. He wanted something most people take for granted. A moment. And for 11 minutes he had it. But fame didn't allow moments. Fame allowed events. And that night became one. The shock that never made headlines. Here's the part most people don't know. There was no scandal headline the next morning. No front-page story. No explosive tabloid cover. No viral clip. Because the story wasn't dramatic enough for the media. No fight. No breakdown. No scandal. Just two famous people leaving a restaurant without eating. But inside Michael Jackson, something broke quietly. Not in rage. Not in tears. In resignation. He had tried. He had hoped. He had planned. And the world had said no. Not maliciously. Not intentionally. But inevitably, the hidden meaning of 11 minutes. 11 minutes and 34 seconds. That's how long Michael Jackson was allowed to be human in public that night. Not a superstar. Not a legend. Not an icon. Not a myth. Just a man. That number became symbolic. Not officially. Not publicly. But emotionally. It became a reminder. A reminder that no matter how carefully he planned, no matter how discreet he dressed, no matter how quiet he moved, the world would always find him. And not leave. Whitney's perspective, a witness to loss. Whitney Houston later spoke privately about moments like this. Not in interviews. Not on stage. But in conversations with friends. She understood what Michael Jackson was losing. She understood the weight of being adored by millions and touched by no one. She understood what it felt like to be surrounded by people and yet isolated. That night she saw it firsthand. She saw how quickly a normal moment could be destroyed. She saw how fragile privacy was. She saw how easily joy could be replaced by panic. She saw Michael Jackson not as a superstar, but as a friend who just wanted to eat dinner. And she knew. This wasn't a one-time event. This was his life. The restaurant that became a battlefield. The restaurant staff never forgot that night. For them, it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. People pressed against windows. Police rushed in. Helicopters hovered overhead. The building shook. Customers panicked. Waiters froze. It felt less like a restaurant and more like a crime scene. But no crime had occurred. Only fame. Only presence. Only the arrival of Michael Jackson. And the world had reacted like it always did. Too loudly. Too aggressively. Too quickly. Michael Jackson's quiet exit from normalcy. After that night, Michael Jackson tried fewer public outings. He withdrew further. He leaned more heavily into private spaces. He surrounded himself with walls, with gates, with guards, with distance. Not because he hated people, but because people didn't know how to let him exist. He wasn't hiding. He was protecting what little humanity he had left. That dinner became a turning point. Not officially, not publicly, but emotionally. It was the night he realized that normalcy was no longer accessible. Not even for 11 minutes. The myth of wanting fame. People often say, "I wish I were famous." They imagine the applause, the admiration, the love, the wealth, the power. But they don't imagine helicopters over dinner. They don't imagine police barricades over pasta. They don't imagine crowds pressing against windows while they sit quietly with a friend. They don't imagine never being able to walk into a room without altering the entire environment. Michael Jackson lived that reality. Not occasionally, not sometimes, every day. And that night in Pasadena was a reminder. A brutal one, a beautiful one, a heartbreaking one. That fame at its highest level isn't freedom. It's captivity. The symbolism of takeout pasta. 2 bags, 2 containers, 2 silent meals, 2 mansions, 2 empty rooms, 2 legends eating alone. The pasta itself became symbolic, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The meal they wanted, the moment they didn't get, the normalcy they couldn't touch, the life they couldn't live. Michael Jackson didn't talk publicly about that night. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write songs about it. But those who knew him understood. It stayed with him, not as a dramatic story, but as a quiet wound. Michael Jackson, loved by millions, known by few. There's a difference between being loved and being known. Michael Jackson was loved by millions, but known by few. Very few. That night, Whitney Houston knew him. Not as a superstar, not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man who wanted to eat pasta in a restaurant and failed. That night, she didn't see Michael Jackson the performer. She saw Michael Jackson the prisoner. And that image stayed with her. The emotional weight of being untouchable. Fame creates distance. Not physically, emotionally. People stop approaching you as a person. They approach you as a moment, as a memory, as a story they want to tell. They don't see your hunger. They see your fame. They don't see your loneliness. They see your spotlight. They don't see your exhaustion. They see your success. Michael Jackson carried that weight. Every day. And that night it became heavier. Not because of the crowd, but because of the reminder that no matter how much he gave the world wouldn't give him a table for 2. The dinner that became a metaphor. Years later, this story would resurface. Not as gossip, not as scandal, but as a metaphor. A metaphor for the cost of celebrity. A metaphor for the prison of fame. A metaphor for the loss of privacy. A metaphor for the human price of being larger than life. Michael Jackson didn't just lose dinner that night. He lost the illusion that he could ever have one again. The quiet after the storm. When the helicopters left. When the crowd dispersed. When the police packed up. When the restaurant closed. When the streets returned to silence. Nothing looked different. But everything was. The building stood. The tables remained. The candles burned out. But something invisible had changed. Not in the city. Not in the restaurant. In Michael Jackson. A life without small moments. Most lives are built on small moments. Morning coffee. A walk in the park. A late-night snack. A spontaneous dinner. A quiet laugh. A shared dessert. A simple conversation. Michael Jackson didn't have small moments. He had large ones. Staged ones. Broadcast ones. Public ones. Historic ones. But not small ones. And that night he tried to steal one. Just one. And the world took it back. Whitney's silent strength. Whitney Houston was strong. Not just vocally. Emotionally. She carried herself with grace. With humor. With resilience. That night she didn't panic. She didn't cry. She didn't storm out. She didn't complain. She simply stood. She held her friend's hand. She walked out. She went home. She ate her pasta. She lived. But she didn't forget. She never forgot how quickly normalcy disappeared. She never forgot the helicopters. She never forgot the crowd. She never forgot the look on Michael Jackson's face. Not fear. Not anger. Not sadness. Acceptance. Michael Jackson's face in that moment. Those who saw him that night described the same thing. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't dramatic. He was calm. Too calm. The calm of someone who had seen this movie before. The calm of someone who knew the ending. The calm of someone who no longer expected miracles. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He didn't insist on staying. He simply stood. He simply left. He simply accepted. And that was the most heartbreaking part. The unspoken question. That night raised a question no one could answer. What does it mean to be free? Is freedom movement? Is freedom choice? Is freedom anonymity? Is freedom peace? Michael Jackson had wealth. He had power. He had influence. He had admiration. He had resources beyond imagination. But he couldn't eat dinner. What kind of freedom is that? The invisible wall between icon and human. People often say, I want to meet my idol. But they rarely ask, what does my idol lose so I can see them? That night, Michael Jackson lost privacy. He lost peace. He lost a meal. He lost a moment. He lost normalcy. So that people could have a story. So that people could say, I was there. So that people could feel close to him. Even though closeness is what he was trying to achieve and couldn't. The tragedy of being everywhere and nowhere. Michael Jackson was everywhere. On TV. On radio. On magazine covers. On billboards. In record stores. In homes. In hearts. But he was nowhere. Not in public. Not in restaurants. Not in parks. Not in theaters. Not in ordinary spaces. He was a ghost in the real world. Visible, but unreachable. Untouchable. And that night proved it. The quiet legacy of a loud night. The night didn't end in tragedy. No one was hurt. No one was arrested. No one was injured. No windows were broken. No fights erupted. But something invisible shattered. The illusion of normalcy. The hope of anonymity. The dream of being human in public. Michael Jackson walked away not wounded physically, but emotionally. And emotional wounds don't bleed. They linger. The prison that fame builds brick by brick. Fame doesn't build its prison overnight. It builds it slowly. With applause. With praise. With success. With admiration. With opportunities. With wealth. Each brick feels like a blessing. Until you realize you can't leave. Michael Jackson didn't enter fame. He was born into it. And by 1991, the walls were too high to see over. That night in Pasadena was just one more brick. The myth of escape. People often say, why didn't he just go somewhere quiet? He tried. Pasadena was Hollywood. The restaurant wasn't famous. The entrance wasn't public. The clothes weren't flashy. The timing wasn't obvious. The plan wasn't careless. And still, helicopters, crowds, police, media, chaos. Because when you are Michael Jackson, there is no quiet. There is no normal. There is no unnoticed. There is only arrival. And arrival always becomes an event. The loneliness of being a legend. Legends are lonely, not because they lack people, but because they lack equality. Everyone approaches them from below, from awe, from admiration, from curiosity, from desire. Few approach them from beside, from understanding, from shared experience, from normalcy. That night, Whitney Houston approached Michael Jackson from beside, as a friend, as an equal, as someone who understood the cost. And that made the loss even heavier, because even in the presence of someone who understood, they still couldn't eat dinner. The moment that defined a lifetime. Michael Jackson's life was full of defining moments. The moonwalk, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, Heal the World, Super Bowl halftime show, Motown 25. But this moment, this quiet, forgotten, undocumented dinner that never happened, may have defined his humanity more than any stage performance, because it showed what he didn't have. Not fame, not success, not influence, not money, but freedom. The sound of helicopters, the silence of a heart. Helicopters are loud, deafening, overwhelming, unavoidable. But the silence that followed was louder. The silence of two empty dining chairs. The silence of two unopened menus. The silence of two untouched plates. The silence of two people eating alone. The silence of a life that couldn't be lived publicly. Michael Jackson heard that silence long after the helicopters left. The dinner that never happened, but changed everything. No one wrote songs about it. No one filmed it. No one broadcast it. No one documented it. But it happened, and it mattered, because it wasn't about food. It was about identity. It was about humanity. It was about the price of being Michael Jackson. And that price was higher than anyone realized. A final reflection on fame and freedom. If you could trade everything you have, your privacy, your anonymity, your normalcy, your small moments, your quiet nights, your unnoticed mornings, your simple dinners, for fame, for admiration, for wealth, for influence, would you? Michael Jackson didn't choose fame. Fame chose him. And by the time he realized the cost, it was too late to return the receipt. The legacy of that night. Today, when people talk about Michael Jackson, they talk about his music, his influence, his innovation, his impact, his controversies, his legacy. But rarely do they talk about his loneliness. Rarely do they talk about his isolation. Rarely do they talk about his inability to sit in a restaurant. But maybe that's the story we need to remember most. Not the stadiums, not the records, not the awards, but the dinner that never happened. Michael Jackson, the man behind the myth, behind the glove, behind the moonwalk, behind the music, behind the fame. There was a man who wanted to eat pasta with a friend, a man who wanted to feel normal for 11 minutes, a man who wanted to sit in a chair without a crowd forming outside, a man who wanted to live. And that man didn't get his dinner, the story that could only belong to him. Many people have been famous. Few have been Michael Jackson. No one else in history has carried the weight he carried. No one else has been watched the way he was watched. No one else has been followed the way he was followed. No one else has been loved the way he was loved. And no one else has lost normalcy the way he lost it. That dinner wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. reflecting the truth of his life. The final image. Picture this. 2 containers of pasta. 2 mansions. 2 legends. 2 silent meals. 2 lives. 2 hearts. 2 people who tried to be human and were reminded they weren't allowed to be. And above it all, the echo of helicopter blades. Closing thoughts. This wasn't just a story about Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston. This was a story about fame, about privacy, about humanity, about the invisible cost of being visible, about the prison that admiration builds, about the loneliness that success creates, and about the simple things we take for granted, like sitting at a table, like ordering food, like eating with a friend, like being unnoticed. Michael Jackson never got that. Not that night. Not after. Not ever again. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you see fame differently, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because there are countless untold stories waiting to be heard, and your support helps keep them alive.